Thank you so much, Zach. Zach is the executive director of the Big Love Network, which I am the COO of. I'm sure y'all have enjoyed our festivals or different neighborhood events and things throughout the years. Thank you so much, Zach, for sharing your spirit and your words of wisdom and your wonderful looping abilities with us tonight. I'm going to continue on with a story from the reservation. Linwood had invited us to his land. Now, the Lippman School has been doing this trip for over a decade and working with Linwood for many of those years. He'd never invited them over. This was the first time. As we greeted Linwood, we got Angela Miller, who is my own personal elder, settled into his house. We watched as Linwood doted over his son Randall, who is the one child that is taking after his father and learning traditional ways of making tools and jewelry, all sorts of things, learning how to use the earth around him. I chuckled as a beautiful red sheepdog and a black cat followed me around Linwood's property. The day before, Linwood had said, "If you've got a good soul, animals follow you." How was I so lucky to be here? I mean, it was really all Angela's fault. Even though fate had tried several times to connect me to the Lippman School, it was my elder who advocated for me. See, I had been in this journey of gardening since I was 3. My mother's family were Italian farmers, and 2 generations ago came over on the boat, worked on the railroads, eventually to own a grocery store in Collinwood in Cleveland. In the 1950s, fast food franchises targeted Catholic immigrant family-run businesses, and my family was one of those. Eventually, they chose a business that would become KFC. I mean, all they had to do was make pizza and create and do the original recipe. The pizza was already inherent in what they were doing. All they had to do to be part of the franchise was have the original recipe. This did not last long as KFC generated their brand. This whole while that they owned and had built much stock in KFC, they maintained their gardens. Fruit trees and asparagus, chickens in the backyard, always dependent on the earth, not giving up on their farmers' roots, while they systematically created high blood pressure and diabetes in poor Black neighborhoods. My mother and her sister went into healthcare as their own form of rebellion. But my mother moved to Dover, Ohio to raise her children, and the thing that she loved the most about it was being able to buy food directly off the farm. Cooking and gardening is what has defined me as an Italian American woman. It is a major factor in my long matrilineal line that has always run things. And on my father's side, my grandfather, Poppy, was a stubborn old Czech man who worked with his hands and kept a huge backyard with 2 great big ponds. They were actually pretty small, but as a child, they were ginormous to me. His family had broken ties with the Catholic Church as they loaded their family up to come to America. And he used to always say to me that those Native Americans had it right when it came to what God was, when it came to our connection to the earth. And I always believed him. I mean, why not? It made sense to me. When I was in fourth grade, my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer in one lung and emphysema in the other. And I went to church that Sunday. In Sunday school, after the sermon, there was a girl who was everyone's favorite. And she said, "If you don't believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you are not going to heaven." And I said, "Well, my grandfather doesn't believe that, and I know he's going to heaven." And my Sunday school teacher looked me straight in my fourth grade face and said, "Honey, no, he's not." I turned my back on the church that day, never turned back. My mother tried for a really long time to see if I'd be into Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism, Islam. She read me books from all of the major world religions, but it wasn't until I was in sixth grade that I realized that I was a witch. So after the meeting with Sam, Matt, and John, in which Angela and I decided that we were going to go on this trip because I was going to do this garden for the Littman School, I sat in Angela's car for a solid half hour and cried, mostly at her, in part out of grief and in part out of relief. I felt like in some way my life brought me to this place. I listened intently and scurried behind my new elder as he explained each plant and his history's family on the land. All the while, the black cat and red dog keeping pace. I noticed many things without speaking. The varying colors in the soil showing the different minerals, edible fruits and berries growing off the banks of the rivers, and the medicinals and the turnips in the fields. And I listened for the words, emotions, content, and most importantly, needs met and unmet by my newfound elder. And though he rang this resonance, and though it rang with me this resonance of my purpose here on this planet and in my life. See, after my last assault, when I was a senior in college, I had really bad PTSD. I barely left my bed. It was hard for me to write papers. It was hard for me to take tests. The anxiety was too much. And my friend that I had made through organizing and the Pan-African Studies Department, Demario Cooper, had started working for the Ohio Organizing Collaborative and helped to start the Way of Mind and Body, the womb, on the east side of Akron. He started pulling me out of my bed and making me go to community organizer trainings. For this, I will forever be indebted to him. And by finding a place with organizers at the womb, I again begin to find a home with open mic nights and community organizing. And they wanted to start a garden. So I shortly followed them to Akron. In in order to work for the OOC and pursue my passion in community organizing. Now, fast forward 2 years later, and budget cuts and broken promises, and I wanted to give up community organizing, but not my family at the womb. And as I proceeded to try to quit community organizing, the goddess kept putting larger and larger objects in my way and smacking me with them whenever she felt like I wasn't listening. It got to a point where I was in a car accident. I was ran off the road by a truck. I should not have survived. 1 month of concussion and rehabilitation later, and it was spring. So I did what women in my family do, and I got dirty. I started planting the garden. I got really creative with stuff. I made things out of planters out of pallets and used tires and all sorts of things, but the city considered it all trash. So they threatened to tear it apart. I pled with city council. I tried to figure out who it was that I needed to talk to in the city. I'd only been in the city for a year and a half. I didn't know who to talk to, and nobody wanted to tell me who I should talk to, and Moneypenny was no help. They removed the garden anyways. They tore down 3 trees, built garden boxes that were given to us from Let's Grow Akron, just because they considered something trash that our community found health and treasure. I realized that what capitalism deemed as trash could provide so much for poor communities, that food and food access was political, that green spaces in the hood were political. A year later, I started doing big love festivals. These were designed to be transformational festivals for and by the citizens of Akron so that we could start to transform out of the oppressive years of the dawn. There were giant art installations. We'd take over entire buildings from Musica and Uncorked all the way over to Summit Art Space. We realized that we were placemakers. We always would do this in the winter in order to warm people to the public life for the warm months to come and get them excited to plan ahead instead of dreading the cold outside. From there, I ended up hanging out on Blueberry Hill and eventually went up to Cleveland to the Green Triangle to get my first permaculture design certification. This finally enabled me to say that permaculture is defined as the only design methodology that has human ethics behind it, which is fair share, people care, and earth care, that is based on indigenous knowledge in order to create closed-looped, sustainable, regenerative systems. It made me see that oppression is designed down to our city blocks, and the way out was also through design. Natural design, biomimicry. From our products like Purell dispensers to our community conversations, decision making, and down to our neighborhood designs. So I learned from people all over America, a little in Canada too, about returning to the village in a city. I learned that feminine design is round while the patriarchy puts everything in boxes. And I learned that no matter where you are, life happens in the center, and its edges should be protected so that life can prosper. These are design methodologies of indigenous people from around the world, if we only cared to listen. And I looked at Linwood as his plants echoed of ones at home, and how they each had their part, and that my part in the great ecosystem that we find ourselves is to create food forests in low-income neighborhoods and food independence for the times to come. I looked over the rolling hills that fed into the river and was more thankful than ever for knowledge of growing food and medicine for the Black community who has always provided me with safety.